Beyond the Red Line. Episode 5. The Riverside Prostitute Killer. Death Roots in Lake Elsinore. Southern California sells sunshine on postcards, palm trees, lakes, orange groves. But if you drive far enough out of Los Angeles, past the freeways and the outlet malls, you hit pockets of nothing. Dry fields, industrial parks, drainage ditches, forgotten motels on the edge of Riverside County. From 1986 to 1991, someone used those spaces as disposal sites. Women started turning up in alleys, orange groves, along Lake Elsinore's rocky shoreline, dumped behind bowling alleys and on the sides of lonely roads. Most of them were street-based sex workers, the kind of women cops, judges, and newspapers were used to ignoring. Their killer had a day job with the county. He delivered furniture to the same task force that was trying to catch him. His name was William Lester Suff. The press would call him the Riverside Prostitute Killer and the Lake Elsinore Killer. Tonight on Beyond the Red Line, we're going back to the Inland Empire, into his childhood, his first murder in Texas, his job inside the government, the women he stalked, and the cold case that finally came back to life in 2024, long before anyone heard the name Riverside Prostitute Killer. Bill Lee Suff, later known as William Lester Suff, was already a convicted murderer. He was born August 20th, 1950, in Torrance, California, the oldest of 3 brothers. He grew up mostly in Paris, California, out in Riverside County. High school classmates remembered him as average, not particularly popular, but not an obvious outcast. He played in the marching band, graduated in 1968, and married his teenage girlfriend Terrell the very next year. On the surface, it looked like a normal young marriage. A son, born in 1970. A daughter, Digiania, born in July 1973. Behind closed doors, it was something else. Terrell later told reporters and the courts that Suff was controlling, verbally abusive, and violent, both toward her and the baby. Nurses and family members noticed bruises on the infant almost from birth. On September 25th, 1973, when their baby girl was just 2 months old, Terrell left the house for a short time. Suff stayed home alone with the children. When she rushed back, the baby was unconscious. She died shortly after. An autopsy showed repeated abuse. In 1974, a Texas jury convicted Suff of murdering his daughter. The couple had been living in Texas by then. He was sentenced to 70 years in prison. Terrell was initially convicted as well, but her conviction was later overturned for lack of evidence she'd been the abuser. His was upheld. You'd think that would be it, 70 years. Life effectively over. Instead, on March 6, 1984, after serving only 10 years, William Suff was paroled out of Texas and allowed to walk free. A man who had already killed a baby now had a second chance at life. No one yet knew how many women would pay for that decision. After his release, Suff returned to California, this time as a free man with a murder conviction and a parole record. By the mid-1980s, he was living around Lake Elsinore and Riverside County, working a series of jobs and eventually landing one that would make the case even more surreal: a warehouse clerk for Riverside County itself. From that job, he helped deliver office furniture to government agencies, including the task force investigating the prostitute murders that he himself was committing. Riverside County, at that time, was a mix of booming bedroom communities, feeding Los Angeles, Old Citrus, and farming towns, and pockets of deep poverty and addiction. Street-based sex work clustered along certain corridors, truck stops, motels, stretches of road where women in miniskirts and heels climbed in and out of cars for quick dates. It was a perfect hunting ground for someone who knew the area, drove at odd hours, and understood which victims were least likely to be reported missing. By 1986, bodies started appearing. In the pre-dawn hours of February 22, 1986, police in South Pasadena, just northeast of downtown Los Angeles, responded to a call about a body in the road. On a quiet stretch of Bank Street, they found a young woman lying in the roadway. She had been stabbed multiple times and strangled. There was no ID on her, nothing to tie her to a name. She became Jane Doe number 17. A few days later, detectives received a call from a man in Lake Elsinore who thought the woman might be his roommate. When he viewed the body, he identified her as 19-year-old Kathy Ann Small, a teen who had been drifting between Lake Elsinore and the Los Angeles area. The roommate told investigators that Kathy had been doing sex work in the Lake Elsinore area and sometimes stayed at his home. The night before she was found, she had reportedly left around 10 p.m., wearing just a nightgown, saying that a man named Bill was giving her $50 to drive with him up to Los Angeles. She never came back. For decades, Kathy Small's murder remained a cold case. Her file sat among dozens of others across Southern California, young women killed in the 1980s, often connected to sex work. Their killers never identified. No one knew then that Kathy was likely the first known California victim of a man who had already killed his own child, and who was just beginning his spree in Riverside County. We'll come back to Kathy later, because in 2024, her case finally exploded back into the news. By the late 1980s, the pattern in Riverside County became impossible to ignore. Women, almost all involved in street-based sex work, were going missing and turning up dead in a tight geographical area: Riverside, Lake Elsinore, and surrounding communities. Many were found nude or partially clothed, dumped near roads, orange groves, fields, or bodies of water. Here's a condensed timeline of some key cases investigators eventually associated with William Suff. These names are real women, many of them mothers, daughters, and sisters, whose day-to-day lives were reduced in headlines to just one word: prostitute. Suspected early Riverside area victims: October 29, 1986. Michelle Yvette Gutierrez, 26, found dead in Riverside County. Cause of death uncertain but considered suspicious. December 10, 1986. Charlotte Jean Palmer, 25, found dead, possibly smothered. April 29, 1988. Linda Ann Ortega, 37, found stabbed. May 2nd, 1988. Martha Bess Young, 27, found dead, signs of strangulation and an overdose. These victims were not originally tied into a single serial killer narrative. They were cases in a system that often wrote them off as overdose, lifestyle risk, or unknown. Then 1989 hit, and the pattern sharpened. January 10th, 1989. Rhonda Jetmore, 27, a sex worker who survived. She got into a car with a client for a date. He turned violent, choking her and ripping at her clothes. She fought back, smashing him with a flashlight, breaking one of her own teeth in the struggle, and managed to escape when he lost his glasses. She fled, flagged down a car, and the driver even fired a gun at the attacker as she ran. Rhonda later identified the man as William Suff. She would become the only known survivor who got away from his hands. January 17th, 1989. Diane May Talavera, 37, found strangled on a Lake Elsinore beach. June 28th, 1989. Kimberly Little, 28, found manually strangled by the roadside near Lake Elsinore. She would later be one of the 12 murders Suff was convicted of. November 11th, 1989. Julie Lynn Angel, 36, found bludgeoned to death near Alberhill on a road her mother drove every day to work. December 13th, 1989. Christina Tina Leal, 23, found strangled and stabbed. The killings rolled over into 1990. January 18th, 1990. Darla Jane Ferguson, 23, strangled, body dumped in a rural area. February 9th, 1990. Carol Lynn Miller, 35, found smothered, her bodies left in the open. November 6th, 1990. Cheryl Coker, 33, found strangled. Shoe prints and tire impressions at the scene would later become important. December 21st, 1990. Susan Melissa Sternfeld, 27, found strangled. And then 1991, the year when the spree peaked. January 19th, 1991. Kathleen Leslie Milne, 42, strangled and asphyxiated with a sock. April 27th, 1991. Cherie Michelle Pacer, 24, found nude behind a bowling alley in Riverside. A passerby covered her body with a jean jacket before police arrived. Shoe prints, including one on her back, matched prints from the Cheryl Coker case. Semen tests showed multiple donors, and the jury later deadlocked on Suff's charges in her death. He was never convicted in this one. July 4th, 1991. Sherry Ann Latham, 37, strangled. August 16th, 1991. Kelly Marie Hammond, 27, found strangled. Possible opiate involvement. September 13th, 1991. Catherine McDonald, 30, stabbed and killed. Signs of neck compression. October 30th, 1991. Delia Zamora, 35, strangled. December 23rd, 1991. Eleanor Casares, 39, stabbed and strangled. Her body found around Christmas. At this point, Riverside County had a full-on serial killer crisis. Similar victim profiles, overlapping dumping grounds, consistent methods of strangulation and stabbing, and a steady drumbeat of bodies from 1986 to late 1991. Investigators formed a task force. They increased patrols in known sex work areas and started quietly warning women on the street that someone was targeting them. They didn't know it yet, but the killer they were tracking was clocking in every day at a county warehouse, stacking boxes, filing paperwork, and sometimes delivering furniture into their own offices. In the end, it wasn't a giant sting operation that brought William Suff down. It was a routine traffic stop. On the night of January 9th, 1992, a Riverside County Sheriff's deputy pulled over a GMC pickup truck for a broken taillight in Lake Elsinore. The driver was a 41-year-old county warehouse worker, William L. Suff. As the deputy wrote the ticket, he noticed things in the cab that felt off. Accounts vary slightly, but according to court records and news reports, inside the truck officers found a bloody knife, rope, and other items that immediately raised red flags for detectives already hunting a serial killer targeting sex workers. Ballistics, fiber evidence, hair comparisons, and witness statements started lining up. Fibers from Suff's home and belongings were linked to some victims. Shoe prints and tire tracks were compared. Surviving victim Rhonda Jetmore came forward more forcefully, and other witnesses tied his vehicle to women who had vanished. When detectives searched his home, they found objects linked to several victims, personal items, clothing, things that didn't belong to his household. The quiet county employee was suddenly the prime suspect in a series of murders that had terrorized sex workers for years. In March 1995, the capital murder trial of William Lester Suff began in Riverside County Superior Court. It would last months and include more than 50 days of testimony. Prosecutors painted a picture of a sexual sadist who cruised areas known for prostitution, picked up women under the pretense of buying sex, then strangled, stabbed, and sometimes mutilated them, dumping their bodies in isolated or semi-public spaces as if discarding trash. They presented forensic evidence, hair from Suff that matched samples at 2 crime scenes, fibers from his clothing and sleeping bag that matched fibers found on victims, testimony linking his truck to tire impressions at dump sites, statements from street workers who had seen him circling the strolls repeatedly. They also brought in evidence of his Texas conviction, the baby daughter he'd killed years earlier, and of abuse toward another infant from a later relationship, showing a long pattern of violence. The defense tried to poke holes, suggesting alternative suspects and arguing that forensic evidence wasn't conclusive. They emphasized that one juror in a separate case had deadlocked on the Cherie Payseur murder, implying the state was overreaching. Suff himself never took the stand. He sat at the defense table, expression flat, as survivors, cops, forensic experts, and the families of the murdered women described the wreckage he'd left behind. On July 19th, 1995, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty of 12 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder for his attack on Rhonda Jetmore. They could not unanimously agree on a 13th murder count, the Payseur case, so that charge effectively fell away. But for the others, the outcome was clear. During the penalty phase, prosecutors brought in additional evidence tying him to a 1988 San Bernardino victim and further examples of child abuse. After deliberating only about 10 minutes, the jury recommended the death penalty. On October 26, 1995, the judge formally sentenced William Lester Suff to death, sending him to San Quentin State Prison's death row. Decades later, in 2014, the California Supreme Court reviewed the case and upheld both his conviction and his sentence. And even though California has since halted executions, Suff remains condemned, expected to die in custody. But his story still wasn't finished. Remember Kathy Ann Small, the 19-year-old whose body was found in South Pasadena back in 1986, listed for years as Jane Doe number 17. In August 2024, nearly 38 years later, her case finally got a name to go with the killer. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department Cold Case Unit had been re-examining Kathy's file using modern forensic tools. Biological evidence stored from her murder was analyzed again. DNA profiles were compared against databases and known offenders. One of the hits was a familiar name, William Lester Suff, already on death row as the Riverside Prostitute Killer. Investigators traveled to speak with Suff, now in his 70s, at San Quentin, according to press conferences and reporting at the time. When confronted with the new DNA evidence, Suff admitted to killing Kathy Small. He told detectives he had stabbed her multiple times in the chest after an argument and left her in the road in South Pasadena. He acknowledged knowing her from the Lake Elsinore area and said she had been doing sex work and staying at his place for a period of time. The story lined up chillingly with what Kathy's former roommate had told detectives back in 1986, that she had left their house at night, saying she was going to meet a man named Bill who was paying her $50 for a ride to LA. Nearly 4 decades later, that offhand detail, a man named Bill, had finally been given a full name. Authorities announced that Suff was now formally linked to Kathy's murder, and they hinted at something else. They were still looking into the possibility of a second suspect or person of interest connected to that night. The 2024 revelation did a few things. It confirmed that Suff's killing in California started at least as early as 1986, predating some of the Riverside County murders he was convicted for. It showed how forensic DNA and cold case work can still reach into the past and drag up names that thought they were safe behind bars. And it reminded everyone that, for many families, the story doesn't end with a death sentence. It ends when they finally hear the truth about what happened. For Kathy's loved ones, there was no happy ending. But there was finally an answer. Looking at William Bill Suff, the obvious question is, how did he get away with this for so long? The system let him out. 1. He was sentenced to 70 years for murdering his 2-month-old daughter and served only 10. By the time most people would be starting year 11 of a long sentence, he was out, moving back to California and getting a job with the county. If that sentence had been served even halfway, most of his Riverside victims would still be alive. 2. He blended into bureaucracy. Suff wasn't some drifter living under a bridge. At the time of the Riverside murders, He was a county warehouse clerk, showing up to a government job, cashing a paycheck, and literally delivering furniture to the offices of detectives hunting the Riverside Prostitute Killer. People who worked with him described him as helpful, chatty, even friendly. There was nothing about his appearance, a slightly doughy, middle-aged white man with a mustache, that screamed serial killer. 3. He targeted women the system already didn't protect. Almost all of his known and suspected victims were street-based sex workers. Many had a substance use struggles. Several were estranged from family or couch surfing around the area. If they disappeared, days or weeks could pass before anyone realized. Sometimes no one filed a missing person report. When their bodies turned up, the term prostitute in reports often did as much work shutting down empathy as it did describing risk. 4. The landscape worked in his favor. Riverside and Lake Elsinore had plenty of places to dispose of bodies: orange groves, drainage ditches, vacant lots, roadside brush. Some remains weren't found right away. Others were mistaken for overdose or non-homicide deaths until patterns emerged. 5. Survivors weren't taken seriously enough. Rhonda Jetmore escaped his attack in 1989 and identified him years before his arrest. But at that time, he didn't get taken fully out of circulation. Her story was one voice up against a man who looked respectable, had a job, and could afford an attorney. How many more women died after the system's first real warning shot? 6. Serial killers learn from the system. Suff had already been through the courts once for murder. He knew how evidence was collected, what cops asked, what could be pled down. Over time, he adapted, moving bodies, varying locations, targeting people he believed no one would fight for. All of that combined into a perfect storm. A violent man the system gave a second chance, hunting women the system didn't value, in spaces where bodies could vanish into the geography. With a case like this, there are always unanswered questions and dark possibilities. Did he kill more than we know? Officially, Suff is convicted of 12 murders and tied to at least one more, Kathy Ann Small, plus an attempted murder and several suspected cases. But the list of women who vanished in the Inland Empire in the late 80s and early 90s is longer than his charge sheet. Some investigators quietly suspect his true victim count might be closer to 20 or more, including some of the suspected cases and others never formally linked. Did he have help? Officially, authorities have not charged any accomplices in the Riverside murders. But in the 2024 Kathy Small case, LA County investigators have talked about a possible second suspect, someone who might have been involved that night or known what happened. That raises hard questions. Was someone else riding along occasionally? Did anyone suspect and choose silence? How many stories were lost because victims were sex workers? Most coverage in the early 90s reduced these women to Riverside prostitutes. Their individual lives, their kids, their dreams, their addictions and attempts at recovery, their jokes, their favorite songs, rarely made it into print. When you treat a whole category of people as disposable, you make them vulnerable to predators who think exactly the same way. William Bill Suff liked to see himself as a clever man. He beat a long sentence, got a government job, played the role of the ordinary coworker while stalking women at the margins of his own county. He thought no one would connect the dots between motel rooms, truck stops, and bodies in orange groves. He thought the word prostitute would be enough to make the world look away. For years he was right, but the truth is, he never hunted alone. He hunted in partnership with a parole system that turned a child killer loose early, a legal system that didn't fully believe sex workers, and a culture that sees some women as background noise in men's stories. The women whose names we do know: Kimberly Little, Christina Leal, Darla Ferguson, Carol Miller, Cheryl Coker, Susan Sternfeld, Kathleen Milne, Sherry Latham, Kelly Hammond, Catherine McDonald, Delia Zamora, Eleanor Casares, and now Kathy Ann Small, paid with their lives for every blind spot. There are others we only know as case numbers, as Jane Doe, as a line in an old report. Telling their stories isn't just about revisiting horror. It's about drawing a new line, one that says, sex workers deserve safety, addicts deserve safety, poor women deserve safety, and that a life lived on the edge of the freeway is still a life worth the full weight of an investigation. William Suff sits on death row now, aging inside concrete, his hunting days over. But the patterns that let him thrive still exist in different forms, in different cities, on different strolls, where women step into strangers' cars, hoping this one is just another date, not the last ride they'll ever take. This is Beyond the Red Line. Tonight, you've walked the death routes of the Riverside Prostitute Killer, a man who thought his victims were invisible, and a reminder that the most dangerous predators are the ones the system is willing to overlook.